Well, again, good afternoon. I'm very pleased with how many of you made the effort to travel to be with us today for this celebration. For a number of years now, I've been wanting to have a Mass exactly like this in a rural community with primarily these folks that make their living from the land. And now that I'm beginning my third year as president of Catholic Rural Life, which is a national organization, I thought, well, the time has come. So I'm glad that our executive director, Mr. Jim Innes, was able to join us as well. He flew in from Minneapolis last night, and he'll be giving a presentation after Mass once we get all the food served so that we can help everybody be a little more aware of the work of Catholic Rural Life. But the main thing that I want to accomplish with this celebration today is to make very clear that the Church affirms your way of life. We affirm those who make their living from the land, those who work really as collaborators with the Creator, with what He has created. I just returned from about a 4-week time of rest and vacation with my own family back in southern Indiana. My folks are getting elderly. My mother is getting pretty well progressed with the Alzheimer's right now, and I just really knew I needed a little extra time with them. But my brother and I also own some property in southern Indiana. It's not for farming in the sense that you farm here. It's forest. So we're into harvesting quality timber. But that too is one of the things that God has created. So every morning after I would get my prayers in, have my coffee, visit with my folks a little bit and get a little breakfast, I would try to be up at the farm by 7 or 7:30. And I cannot tell you how good it felt to have worked up a good sweat and to be soaking wet by 10 o'clock in the morning. Now, we got a lot more humidity in southern Indiana to deal with than we have out here. But it felt so good to do something that made my muscles ache at the end of the day. It felt so good to look at what God had provided and to say, okay, what's my role here to improve this? What's my role here to work hand in hand with what God has created? To honor what God has given, and to somehow or another recognize that inherent dignity and wisdom of all of God's creation, and to turn it into something for the common good of all of God's people. And that's really at the heart of the dignity of human labor. But maybe it's just because of where I grew up and what I was naturally accustomed to doing and how certainly this particular part of God's creation grows up, that it feels good to get your hands dirty and to work a sweat and to wake up the next morning a little achy and sore from what you did the day before. There was a family in Indianapolis. They had 9 kids, and every one of them became a priest or a nun. And their dad used to love to say, yeah, I had 9 kids and not a one of them makes an honest living. This crowd knows what it's like to make an honest living. But there's a number of things in the readings today that are good reminders for all people, but I think particularly for those who make their living as ranchers and farmers, that as ingenious as your way of life is, as difficult and back-breaking as that work can be, as challenging and as frustrating as it can be with some of the real threats that Mother Nature throws at you, the basic starting point is that you're working with what was there before you. You're working with creation. You're working with what the Bible says God created in 7 days, but with what we know from science since that time is stuff that was developed literally over millions of years in the land that you ranch and farm till and keep today. And that's really the first point, is to recognize the relationship that every human person is called to with the Creator. And that first reading today, after Moses pleads with God to send food for this vast horde of people that have followed him into the desert, and God hears and answers that prayer, the people thank Moses for the food that they have. And we know it wasn't Moses who provided that food. It was the Creator. It was God. And it's important for us who make our living by the sweat of the brow to realize, yes, we've had a hand to play in what eventually appears on the table of those who enjoy the fruits of those labors. But the basic ingredients that we work with were a part of God's creation. The ingenious wisdom that's inherent in the DNA of the herds of cattle or horses or sheep, that ingenious wisdom of the genetic makeup of every seed that the farmer puts into the ground, the genius and wisdom of the Creator who makes the sun rise and set, and the moon and the stars that keep watch at night, and the dew that comes at night, and the rains, preferably softly, and all of the seasons of the year that make things fruitful. And really, that's the work of the rancher and the farmer, first and foremost, is to recognize the wisdom of God's creation and what their role, your role, is in cooperating with God's genius, with God's wisdom. And then to bring our own intelligence to bear as to how we bring forth from God's creation what God intends for the common good of all of His people. So that's that first relationship that's present. You know, for those who live in the cities and make their dwellings and their livings behind a desk or in so many other ways, there's that step that's easy to miss of the relationship with God, of what's given originally came from God. And that whatever is created is ultimately for the good of God, for the common good of God's people. Somewhere in the midst of that, yes, a living has to be made. But ultimately, the first priority is being in tune with what is God calling me to do with my life for Him? How is the toil and labor of my hands meant for the common good of another? And even beyond the feeding of my own family around the table of my home. Because that's the other real serious relationship that we want to reflect upon, is not just the relationship with God's creation and not just the relationship with God the Creator, but the relationship with all of God's people. And that's got to go beyond my own family. That's got to go beyond my own home. Ultimately, it's got to go beyond my own community and my own parish. These are just very simple things, and they flow naturally from the Scriptures, because this is really God's compass for anyone who wants to know how to live their life in right relationship with God, with creation, and with all of God's people. Now, I served as a pastor of a number of rural communities in southern Indiana before I became the chief shepherd of this portion of God's family in Wyoming. And I must say, even though I know this is being recorded, my favorite assignments were the rural assignments. My really, truly favorite assignments were being with the farmers. We didn't have too many ranchers in southern Indiana, but a lot of farmers. And I loved being invited to get in the tractor in the spring and prepare the fields with them. I loved being invited to drive one of the trucks to haul the grain from the field in the fall. They never would quite trust me with a cultivator of any kind. Of course, that was probably the way I handled the tractor in the spring when there was nothing in my way. But it's so obvious that you're working hand in hand with the Creator. And there was something about the families from these rural areas that understood the natural cycle of life, whether from their flocks or whether from the seasons. They knew there was an inherent law of God at work. And if somehow or another they did not abide by the natural laws of God, they were not going to be able to provide for their families. And so it was easy for them to recognize the natural laws that we call the moral laws of God at work in the human relationships, at work in the human family, and to raise their children according to that law of God, to respect that, and to recognize a rightful role of the family in the parish community, and to be actively engaged with that parish, to realize that they needed more than just their own family at times to make everything work. And my guess is, for all of you, you know there are times in the seasons and the year or in emergencies where you need to call upon your neighbors. And most of the time they are readily at hand to come to your aid. And that same law applies at a much broader level of society, where we recognize we're not alone. And not only that we're not alone, but we need other people. And other people need us at times. And that too is a part of how God created all of His family. To need Him first. To be in relationship with one another. To assist one another with compassion and mercy. And ultimately to treat what He created with great reverence and respect, because it's ultimately what provides for every one of our human needs. And I want to affirm how you all are doing that, even though you may not have put it in those words. But to lift up this way of life that God has chosen for you, and that you have chosen along with God. And clearly there are many implications to this rural way of life that we want to lift up for other people to embrace. We want to lift up the values of this way of life for the rest of our culture to examine and to find good and to live by it as well. In the gospel today, Jesus tells us to not work for food that perishes, but for the food that endures for eternal life. And it's a good reminder to us that yes, we are working to provide food that perishes, but food that provides fundamental, essential nourishment to feed the human family of this earth. But ultimately, what's most important is providing that food of faith. The food that never perishes. And that's our belief in Jesus Christ. That's our belief in the God who created all things, that He's entrusted to us for our brief journey on this life to till and keep, to be good stewards, to draw forth from God's creation the sustenance for all of the human family. Thank you for what you do, but mostly thank you for your faith. And please God, that faith will continue to be handed down for many more generations, and along with it, this beautiful way of life that walks hand in hand with God and all of God's family.